Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Julie. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for investing in what is our 9th event of the year at the London branch. Really pleased to have a very topical subject and a very knowledgeable speaker in Ray Sykes, who works at UCL in London, and it's emergency planning and business continuity, which of course after the events of the last 2 years is something that we all need to be considering and in a little bit more detail. So with that as a thought at the back of your minds, I'd just like to hand over to Ray. So let's dive right in. Ray, over to you.
Excellent, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. I would firstly just like to thank very much, obviously, Greg and also Julie for asking me along, and one of my colleagues and friends, Dev, who is obviously one of your members as well. So thank you for asking me along, and I'm very pleased to have a chat with you. I've only got a couple of slides, so I can assure you it isn't certainly not going to be death by PowerPoint. So it's more talking, and I'm very keen for interaction with people. So I would encourage people, as I mentioned to Greg and Julie, do raise questions if you have any. I'm very happy to chat things through. Okay, so as the slide says, let's dive right in really with this. Very briefly about me, and I know there was an intro already circulated, but I was a police officer for 26 years. I originally joined Essex Police in the early 90s, then transferred to the City of London Police in the summer actually of 2001. And as you'd imagine, in 26 years, certainly in the police, I've held a range of different posts, but sort of more pertinent really to this sort of conversation that we're launching into. Really, I was the head of emergency planning and business continuity management for the City of London Police, and I had a small team of people there, amongst a range of other things. I was also a counter-terrorism officer and ran a team of officers that used to do counter-terrorism, CTSA, counter-terrorism security advisors, they call it, and also have a background in counter-terrorism intelligence as well. So a range of stuff and plenty of other stuff peppered amongst that, as you might guess. I retired from the City of London Police in 2017, and I worked for just over a year or so for the City of London Corporation, and that's the local authority for the square mile in the city. And I held, I suppose really I wore two hats, you could say, for them. I was their high-risk domestic violence case conference coordinator. They call it MARAC, Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conferencing. And I wore that hat for them. And also I was a counter-terrorism prevent intervention officer. So you probably would have heard of the prevent strand of the counter-terrorism strategy. So I worked on that for them. And then really, like ever, and probably like many people, I had a look around and sort of found my feet, so to speak, in the outside world. And I applied and was successful in joining University College London in 2019, and I worked for them as a business continuity management advisor. So enough about me, and if you really want to know more, give me a ring, and if you can't sleep, I'll tell you all about it, really. So let's have a swim around emergency planning and business continuity management. And I think what might be useful is we'll consider, what they actually are and what are the connections, and then we're going to sort of see why it can get confusing, because certainly what I found working in the industry for the last, since I retired from the police, is that when you come out of the emergency services or the military or those types of organizations, you come out with a level of assumption that people are used to managing incidents, and that people actually are used to breaking things down into bite-sized chunks and addressing them. And then after a little while, you realize your assumptions are actually, and probably naturally quite wrong, really, because people aren't going to have that background knowledge, or experience necessarily. And then there's a bit of an awakening, and then you discover there's an awful lot of confusion going on. So let's have a look and just see why it can be confusing. So let's think a little bit about definitions here, really. And I think it's useful to sort of think about the terminology to see why things get confused and why things can be misinterpreted, really. And collectively, we will look at how some of these processes, once we've sort of got the gist of what we're talking about, how these processes apply to live incidents. And we'll think about the preparations and mitigations that we might be able to put together, whether that's on behalf of the organisation we're working for, on behalf of perhaps a client, like I would imagine many of you would do. So just to be clear, really, before we start, we're thinking about incidents that are above the level of business as usual. So the BAU type of work that people have to deal with is, the joys of managing a business, a department, or an organisation. That is part of managing daily problems. So that's BAU. But let's think about the stuff once it gets above BAU. You could say, well, actually, even if we think about BAU, the bar and the level is going to be different in different organisations. So I think actually, if you're going to work within a new organisation or currently in your own or working for a client, it's wise to look at where that BAU bar actually sits, because the BAU for incident management in the police, for example, is a very different BAU for incident management at University College London, as you might expect. And I would imagine that's probably quite common across different sectors as well. Okay, we haven't even started about emergency planning yet. So do we call it emergency planning, or should we call it crisis management? Let's look at this a little bit closer, actually, and I think to see what's actually in a name. And I think then hopefully we'll get some clarity why we don't need to get hung up on a name. Because to me, and in my experience, it's more about the purpose. I think what we need to clarify is what is the purpose of the planning that we're trying to do, and what do we actually want to achieve? So if we think a little bit about definitions, we think about emergency planning according to the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004, and those that have worked or are working in the public sector will be quite familiar with that. Emergency plans, according to the Civil Contingencies Act, say they may take the form of generic plans, and they should set out the core of a Category 1 responders and their responses and recovery to and from an emergency, or that they should develop specific plans to deal with particular hazards or particular sites. And then that Civil Contingencies Act goes on with its definitions about Category 1 responders will probably adopt a combination of the paragraphs. So then it implies really in that definition about the connectivity between responding to incidents and managing incidents, and then the aftermath. So if we're thinking about whether we're going to call it an emergency plan, a crisis plan, etc., perhaps we should think about what does an emergency actually mean. Well, again, if we think about the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004, in this part, it says an event or situation which threatens serious damage to human welfare in the United Kingdom or in a part or a region. An event or a situation which threatens serious damage to the environment of the UK or part or a region. And then it also says about war or terrorism, which threatens serious damage to security of the UK. So it's pretty serious stuff, actually. And really what that act is saying to the emergency services and the public sector is about, we need to get something tangible here. We need to not only do that for our own organisations, but actually we need to work collectively. We need to work in coordination. We need to work in partnership with this. Okay, let's just touch briefly again on definitions. If we're going to call it an emergency plan, what's an emergency? This is before we've even started to think about the type of plan. So what is an emergency? If we looked at the Collins Dictionary definition of an emergency, it says an emergency is an unexpected and difficult or dangerous situation, especially an accident, which happens suddenly and which requires quick action to deal with it. So actually then, do we need an emergency plan to deal with an incident or a situation? Or do we need a contingency plan to deal with a specific risk or a particular area of business? So are we needing to create or support our client to create a contingency plan or an emergency plan? So if a client comes to you saying, oh, we believe or we know we want an emergency plan, if we think about that definition, are we to actually plan for the unexpected? Because that dictionary different definitions is an unexpected and difficult or dangerous situation. So if we only plan for something that's unexpected, how does that work then? Because, if we then bring into the equation risk management, which is where many of, the people on this session will actually be from, well, is really an emergency truly unexpected then? Because actually, if we then consider risk, things aren't necessarily unexpected, because we've got things like the London Risk Register. We've got things like the National Risk Register. Across, certainly in the UK, there are county risk registers, and then that breaks down further into different locality risk registers. So are we actually planning for the unexpected? Because if we've got a risk register, we've already identified it as a risk. And so we can then see and work towards creating mitigation. So is it an emergency plan in the first place? So you can see why it all starts to become a bit of a mess and rather cloudy, certainly in my experience, because if somebody says, or again, a customer or a client, or actually one of the senior members of your organization says, oh, well, we need an emergency plan, it's very easy to get thrown, because you can think, well, actually, do they know what they're talking about? Do they know what an emergency is? Do they know that that's what they truly want? So it's worth just doing a little bit of thinking around what we actually want to achieve. Because if we then bring into the equation things like the risk registers, which we clearly should, to look at what risks we might be facing, and then to try and prioritize what things we should develop a plan for, thinking about likelihood and impact, then actually, it starts to sort of take shape a little bit about what we should start to create, rather than jumping in and thinking we need an emergency plan, we need a crisis management plan, we need a contingency plan. Or if you were to Google emergency management, honestly, the amount of info and diversity of definitions and things that crops up is pretty mind-boggling, really. Although you may have realised by now, I originated from the days when no such thing even existed. So, you had to read books about these things and learn from colleagues or through experience. So sometimes a lot of info is a good thing, but it can certainly, in my experience and what I've seen in the industry, really cloud the issue of what you're trying to achieve. So we can certainly see straight away how things can become, very, very, very blurred. One of the sort of drivers, what I found in developing incident response and incident management plans, is it's very, very useful to have a common purpose and core objectives within the plan. So what do we really want to get in this plan? I think for me, the core drivers are to try and support people to get to a situation where they can actually have shared situational awareness and joint understanding of risk. And I think it's a very useful phrase to highlight. And it's worth knowing that phrase, shared situational awareness and joint understanding of risk, isn't just Ray making it up, as many people I think do if you look on the internet, but actually it's actually one of the key drivers in the joint emergency services Interoperability Principles, JESIP, J-E-S-I-P. If you Google it, it's worth a look. So it's not just Ray making it up. I was also a JESIP trainer in the police towards you know, the last couple of years of my policing career, and part of that program, which you'll see if you have a look at the JESIP website, it's tri-service training between the police, fire and ambulance. So as a police trainer, I would work with equal police trainers from the Metropolitan Police and the British Transport Police, and we would work with trainers from the London Fire Brigade and the London Ambulance Service, and we would deliver training sessions that were interactive, and we would use scenarios and short exercises for the whole of the day, with an audience anything between 30 and 40 people at a time, and we would do these monthly. And the idea was that we would get our own people to understand the parameters of our role, but equally we would understand the parameters and how we could interact and coordinate with our colleagues in the other emergency services. And one of the key objectives was this, is so that when we're dealing with incidents at the scene, we can achieve shared situational awareness, and we can achieve joint understanding of risk. And this was a really, really good training session that we used to run. And also to add another element of reality, we used to also encourage attendees from some external agencies. So we would have participants at different management levels. So, you know, from operational people to, you know, tactical and strategic people, so different ranks as well. We would also encourage people from the rail industry and the aviation industries. And I mentioned about above BAU incidents, because as you'd imagine, when things go wrong in the rail sector and the aviation sector, you know, some of those can have, you know, very serious consequences. And actually, I sort of look back with great fondness, really. They were really good interactive sessions, and they made good sense for a grand purpose. So, if we intend to create an emergency plan, or an incident response plan, or a contingency plan, we really should establish what we're trying to achieve and why we believe we need a plan. And then I think once we've established that and agreed it either with our client or we've agreed it with the powers that be in our own organisation, then we can start to apply the core components of a plan to get into a draft. What I've found also in my experience, you know, really we need to be clear that the plan needs to make sense to the user. It needs to have enough flexibility within that plan so it empowers the user to deliver plain. Now, plain, again, is something that I've carried forward really from the JESIP training, most certainly, and also from my own experience in the police. So what's plain all about then? It's a really good little mnemonic to apply really to any incident when you're either preparing plans or actually managing or involved in a live incident. The P, so proportionate. We want this plan or this work or this piece of activity we're delivering to be proportionate, legitimate, accountable, necessary and ethical. So let's touch on that. We want a proportionate response according to the threat and risk that we're faced with. So we don't want a sledgehammer to crack a nut. We need proportionality in what we're doing. Legitimate. We want what we're going to do or the actions we're going to take to be legitimate. So does the law allow us to do these things? Or if you're in an organisation, do you have the authority to be able to do this? So is it legitimate? Are we acting in a proportionate and legitimate way within the power and authority we have to take those actions. If we think about the A, accountable, proportionate, legitimate, accountable. You need to be accountable and take responsibility for the consequences of what you're doing, because there is a possibility, certainly because we're dealing with stuff way above BAU at times, that you could end up in court over this. So we need to be accountable. You know, if you direct that to happen or you cause that to happen, you're going to be accountable for the outcome of it. So be prepared. You know, it's quite a leveler that you could end up in court over that. And as you would imagine, with various inquiries that go on, that often is the case for the emergency services. So if we're accountable as well, what we're going to do needs to be necessary. Is what I'm going to do necessary in light of all the circumstances? And the E, ethical. So are the directions I'm giving, is what is the guidance in the plan that I'm suggesting, is the information ethical? In relation to that, a good sort of gauge to put against this is the Equalities Act of 2010. If we look at the protected characteristics in the Equalities Act of 2010, you need to make sure that some of the directions you're going to do within this plan are also ethical. And perhaps a low-level example, if you're working perhaps on quite a simple contingency plan, perhaps for a manufacturing plant, and you're saying, well, actually, you know, we're prone to flooding, we're near a river, or we're built on a floodplain, and because of the, you know, the increase in rainfall, etc., we've had floods. What we're going to do in that department, we're only going to put men to work in there who are between the ages of 30 and 40, so they're strong enough to pick up the equipment and move it if we get a sudden flash flood. Well, actually, you might think on the face of it, well, yeah, it would work, but actually, is it ethical? Well, no, because you certainly can't say, if you consider employment law, even very basically, you certainly can't decide to do that and not employ people, you know, from other backgrounds, etc., or ladies or whatever. In that, it simply isn't ethical. So proportionate, legitimate, accountable, necessary, and ethical. So if we've actually considered all of these things, if we've considered what type of plan we might need, and we've thought a little bit around what it might be titled, and then we've considered a little bit around what the definitions might be, because actually, if somebody's paying an awful lot of money for this, then they need to get value for money, and it needs to be, you know, pretty much as good as we can provide. And we don't want somebody going on Google and saying, well, actually, this doesn't even fit the definition of that in the first place. So what's that all about? So if we've considered all of these things, perhaps then we can think about actually starting to put pen to paper, so to speak, and look at the level of detail we might want. So I mentioned about core components of a plan. So we need to remember the basics. And when I talk about basics, I'm going to say something super basic now, which I've seen omitted in so many plans. Version control table. I've in the past been asked to review some plans for some quite important corporates. And when I look at what they've got, there's not even a version control on it. You might have to wade through it and find, if you're lucky, you'll find a date. But let's think about the basics regarding components. Version control table of some sort, so you know where you are. Now, thinking about those components in a little bit more detail, a plan should have a short introduction to actually summarize why it exists and also what business area it relates to. I would suggest and advise really that type of introductory information could be quite generic, or it might need to be a bit more specific depending on the plan's intention. But what we don't want in contrast, is a history lesson. I have seen plans where there's at least a couple of pages trying to justify why they should have a plan. And then there's almost a bit of a history lesson in there about various incidents and extremist attacks that have happened and this, that. Well, if somebody wants a history lesson, go and look it up. You don't need that in the plan. It needs to be concise and short. If you put that at the front of a plan, somebody's trying to look at that when they're under pressure, they'll put it to one side and they'll revert to type. So we don't want a history lesson, we want a short intro. One of the other key and core components of a plan is it should have a trigger or an escalation guide that gives the user some assurance that they're applying the plan process and in effect activating the plan. So a short intro and a trigger or an escalation guide. And again, this isn't just Ray making it up. These are components that are also summarised amongst the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004. It will be no surprise to anybody on this call that communication is everything. And I can't emphasise that enough. If you ever deal with any live incident or any exercise or test or whatever you want to call that, any debrief, at the top of the tree is always communication. Nobody told me. I wasn't told in time. I didn't hear about it. If only you'd phoned me. Perhaps we should have met on Teams. Oh, nobody knew where the meeting room was. Communication is absolutely everything. And if you look at inquiries, communication is always at the top of the tree. So you might want to call it emergency communications or crisis communications. And I think I might have seen on your website you've got a comms webinar due, looking ahead on that. But the plan needs to have key contacts for core people. So not a phone directory, but key contacts. So you can start that communication conduit. As I'm sure you'd agree, the joys of COVID have, if nothing good came out of COVID so far, and I think some things have, but the meteoric rise of Microsoft Teams has been really good because it forced people to communicate in an alternative way, added to business resilience. So actually, a lot of core contact initial meetings are done over Teams. It can be done super quick now, almost instantly, and you can set up a predetermined Teams group if you want as well. So the plan needs to have the core contacts for the key people, not everyone, just enough to get the ball rolling. The difficulty with contacts, obviously, is they have to be maintained, which is why I say keep it short and concise. You can use a hyperlink, perhaps, if you have contacts stored somewhere else on a certain drive or on a Teams site, but it wants the key contacts. Also, very, very useful and practical to have your key service partners so that you can actually initiate some mitigation for what's happened, as quickly as you can. I mentioned about Teams, and obviously, Zoom, some people prefer that, etc. I think it also depends in which sort of geographical arena that you're working in. I know in some countries, Zoom is far more popular, but whatever works for your people. Virtual, I think nowadays is very common, although some people, if they're in the office, and some senior level people do like to, I think probably out of necessity sometimes, need to be present in the office as well. So you can do a blend of it, whatever sort of works for your people. Also in the plan, I think it's very, very useful to have a prompt to encourage the user to assess the threat and risk. And what is another very useful tool as a component in the plan, it's very simple and takes up no more than one page of the plan, is the Joint Decision Model, the JDM. This is also on the JESIP website. I hasten to add, I don't get anything out of JESIP. I'm just saying, some of the useful stuff you can draw from different arenas, really. So the JDM, joint decision model, is a really good tool to have in a plan. It's really just a basic cycle. The joint decision model originated as the national decision model, the NDM. The national decision model was created by the College of Policing, and it's one of the fundamental tools that police officers use at all levels for incident assessment and management and response. So that's a really good core component to have in your plan. In actual fact, in the police now, officers sometimes get questioned in court when they're being cross-examined. Officer, did you use the national decision model or the joint decision model? Because in that model, it tells you to gather information. It tells you to consider the threat and risk. It tells you to develop a basic working strategy. It tells you to consider your powers and policies. And I think, you know, we all get the drift of that, but it's certainly worth a look, and it's worth using. I certainly use it within UCL. The plan should then have sort of business specific requirements. So for example, if it's, again, in an operating plant, it might be a core requirement or necessity to sort of isolate or deactivate certain machinery. So specific requirements, you know, need to go in that plan, the sorts of things that will really catch you out if they don't happen. And that's where it's really useful to engage with the people at different levels. So you want to engage with people at the operational level as well as the tactical level, probably even more so at the strategic level, although the budget is probably held at the strategic level. Because what you want is a plan that works for the people. You don't want a plan that looks great on a shelf or on, you know, on a hard drive somewhere, and the people say, well, I know we've got a plan, but have you seen it? It won't work, because if this happens, the whole lot's in the bin. You need to engage at the different levels. Also in the plan, you might have some draft or example communications holding statements, or it might be an option to, as a direction in there, to actually put your comms people on standby. So you might not necessarily need them to do something if you've got something like a rising tide situation. You're thinking, well, this could go one way or the other. You know, let's make a few calls, let's put our people on standby so we can have a little bit of a pre-think about how we're going to manage this and what we might need to say. That is very useful. I also tend to, as another component, put in a draft meeting agenda. And actually, if you really want to start to manage the incident properly and look ahead, it's very, very useful to have very basic decisions and actions log, so that you can record and track the core decisions. And also for protracted incidents, it's useful in a handover. So if you hand over, the other person having to step in can see what's been done, what's still outstanding, and what decisions, you know, they may need to then make to actually keep things rolling. So that's very useful. It's really bread and butter work in emergency services. But obviously in the outside world, it's not quite the same. But equally, what you'll find, if there's an inquiry, and certainly if there's an incident where somebody is seriously injured, or worse, if somebody is killed, there'll at least be a coroner's inquiry, and you know, they will look into the circumstances surrounding the death and to see what could have been prevented. And what you don't want to happen is you haven't got decisions and an actions log, and when 6 months later you're at the inquiry and you're thinking, oh, I wish I'd written that down, I knew I did it. But what you tend to find from a legal perspective is they say if it isn't written down, it didn't happen, because where's the evidence of it? So it's a very wise thing to use a decisions and actions log. Having said all of this, I've seen some plans that have developed into almost like the size of an encyclopedia. And what I would strongly advise here, if this is what you're seeing, or if you're going to do a review, or if you're looking to put something together from scratch, and this starts to happen, you need to take a step back and take some time to just weed out the unnecessary stuff. A good example from things I've seen is where people have sort of cut and paste sections of different emergency manuals or from internet searches into plans, because they sort of almost have a bit of a light bulb moment as they're working through, and they think, oh, well, I know something about it, or I've read about that. So they look it up to sort of, you know, check their knowledge or get a steer, or perhaps I might look at an ISO or a British standard, you know, which is good practice. But don't cut and paste just out of it all into the plan, because although it might make good reading, you know, as we all know, you know, ISOs, British standards get tweaked and updated. And actually, you know, to make this plan useful for us or for our client, you know, we need to make it something that they can actually get hold of and apply to a situation. We're not trying to educate them. We're not trying to get them through the Business Continuity Institute exam. We're not trying to qualify them in, you know, in risk management. You know, we just want to give them the tools to do the job. So, you know, the cut and paste manual stuff that makes the plan the size of an encyclopedia doesn't do anybody any favors. And I've certainly heard it said about plans that are really, really too thick. I've heard somebody say once as a defence, I'm sorry that the plan is so weighty and so thick, I haven't had time yet to actually refine it. And I think that's quite a useful sort of gauge, really. So it's not to educate the user, it's to give them the tools to manage a situation until the main response phase of the incident declines a bit. You can always add appendices at the back in slower time. So you could perhaps add appendices if you want to, you know, like an impact assessment sheet. You could add things like other appendices that might be, you know, a section perhaps from a policy, just to make people aware that there's a policy in relation to this. So really, chronological thinking is a very good steer. You know, we want the plan to be in order and want it to make sense to the user. You know, we want it to actually be able to be realistically applied to an incident or a situation. So what level of detail? Get the fundamentals in there and see what you need. And if you do find you're padding it out, take the time to weed it out. You know, a general rule of thumb that I tend to use is less is more. If we can say something in a sentence, we don't need to say it in a paragraph. And you might be thinking, well, here's the guy that's talking and talking, but I think you get my drift. So maybe now we have a plan to deal with an emergency or whatever we decide to call the plan. So let's have a little think about business continuity then, because some people say, oh, well, I want a business continuity plan. Okay, that's great. So what's a business continuity plan? Or actually, what's business continuity? Be assured, and don't worry too much. I don't want to labour the point of definitions again, because I think you get the angle of where I'm coming from with the definition side of it. I tend to use, in relation to business continuity, as a definition in the BCI, the Business Continuity Institute Good Practice Guidelines. If you looked on, you'd easily find it. You know, BCI Good Practice Guidelines. And I'm not going to read that out because it's quite a paragraph, but there's a definition they use in there. And again, if you were to Google the definition of business continuity, some definitions talk about a holistic approach. This, you know, but, you know, goodness gracious, you can go on and on and on about the definitions with it. There's quite a few variables out there. And also, I'm sure you realise there's a lot of training companies out there who I'm pretty confident have their own interpretations too. And certainly a common factor, that's sort of woven amongst them all is they're all pretty wordy. So I think there's a range of attempts to try and explain what it is by definition, really. But as I say, I'm not going to labour that point. I mentioned ISOs. So the business continuity ISO, as many of you would know, is the 22301. And there's a very short bit in there that isn't the definition of business continuity, but it sort of gives a sentence to define what a business continuity plan is. And I think this is more useful. And really that says it's a documented procedures that guide organisations to respond, recover, resume and restore to a pre-identified level of operation following disruption. And I think that really sort of captures it for me. So it's more about what the business continuity plan is as opposed to what business continuity is. So how does this sort of fit together with incident management? The way I have interpreted and seen this from my experience is more about amalgamation of the two. So to me, business continuity is almost like part 2 of incident management. It relates to managing the impact of the emergency or the incident once you've recovered enough to a suitable state to do that. So you can get access, if you've got a basic business impact analysis, you've got access to legitimate and useful data to then assess what areas of your business delivery have been affected and which ones are then a priority to recover. So a business continuity plan really deals with the continuity of the business activities. So it might have a format that again includes a summary of what it relates to, some key contacts, an escalation and trigger, but it should be aligned with a business impact analysis. So almost here we go with definitions once again. What's a business impact analysis? And there are many, many of those. And I promise you I won't go into it, but what I would say is a business impact analysis, to be very useful, needs to be concise. Business impact analysis can be very complex, but to me, to be useful in a practical way, they need to be very concise. And some preliminary thinking about what is useful around this is a good way to approach it. We want to do a basic business impact analysis that's sort of relevant for its purpose. You don't need a huge complex one. It gives you a starting point to extend, to sort of consider the amount of detail you need across the business areas and dependencies. You want to produce a BI that's again proportionate and useful for its purpose, and we don't want sheets and sheets of Excel documents. I try and use a really concise BI that's really on one tab. Capture the core business areas, capture the dependencies, a little bit of consideration of their risk of loss over time, and then if there's any existing contingencies in relation to them, and if there isn't, then there's some gaps we can start to plug. So this is like a part 2. So let's have a little think about the overlaps and why one is not the same as the other. So really, for the purposes of today, we're thinking about managing the impact with business impact analysis of the aftermath of an incident. We've said about trying to keep it a business impact analysis very concise, and equally we don't need to educate the user all about business continuity management to use it. We just want them to have the core data so that they can see which of their business areas are a priority to recover. And if they do a basic business impact analysis and have done a bit of risk assessment by time, some areas will jump out and they'll say, well, actually, these are my highest risk areas, these are my most important ones, and also there's some others that are quite vulnerable because they are time sensitive if we can't keep them going. And actually, I didn't realise there's some vulnerabilities around this. They might be dependent on very bespoke areas of supply or bespoke machinery or very highly skilled areas of business delivery to actually do them. So that should jump out at people. So they can recognise very quickly where their vulnerabilities are. As I mentioned really about engaging at different levels, the BIA needs to be populated by someone that knows the organisation or how the department works. They should, you should guide them to keep it simple. You don't want it too complex, and you don't want them to overthink it, because the BIA process makes people get into a mindset where they will overthink it, and you need to sometimes rein them in. Simple, focused and concise. And I often say to people, I can't populate your BIA for you, because you're the expert in this area of business. You know your business far better than me. It also encourages them to engage with the process. And once they get the idea, people actually, find it very useful. Okay, so where are we now then? So if we step back slightly and look at the information we now have in our emergency plan, or by whatever name, we've got a framework then, we've got a core document to manage the response phases of an incident. We've also got, if we then bring into the equation, once the dust settles, our basic business impact analysis, we've got some core data to manage the aftermath of the incident. So collectively, we're in a much stronger position to apply both of these processes as a framework for incident management and recovery. So collectively, it puts us in a much stronger position. So although really they're separate entities, emergency plan, business continuity plan, actually they're, the links are really, really useful. There are overlaps in them, although one is not the same as the other. So I sort of really use a sort of a bit of an analogy really. We need to see the constellation and not just the stars in isolation. We need to see the connectivity. And I attended an interesting little session very recently, actually, and no surprise really. There's another ISO. Well, actually, it's not an ISO. It's a British standard coming out. The British standard 65,000, and you'll see on that last slide there, which I promised it wasn't death by a PowerPoint. A little note to that, and that's worth a Google and a skim read. Actually, it's only just come out, and interestingly, it sort of tries to amalgamate the different facets of incident management, incident response and business continuity, and it brings it under that new British standard of organizational resilience. And I've come to learn that certainly in the financial sector, there's a lot more interest going on in that. Now, I'm sure you'd all agree I've rambled on quite a lot, and we've got a little bit of time, so I'm very happy to take any questions that anybody may have. Julie, I don't know if there's anything.
No, we haven't had any questions yet. Greg, do you have any questions for Ray?
Hello all. Yeah, I've got a couple just looking more broadly, Ray, in terms of some of the issues people might have. Is what would you say, or in your experience, is the biggest challenge to organisations in actually developing their emergency preparedness or emergency planning?
I think certainly from what I've seen, one of the biggest challenges is that people or organisations, although they're maybe experts in their field, they've not actually taken the time to do some actually useful basic business impact analysis. So actually what tends to happen is they'll get a business interruption or disruption. So whether that's an incident or an IT outage or a power failure, or an incident goes on that interrupts their service delivery. Often, these things don't happen at convenient times. So the people that are trying to then manage it may be people that have recently come into post, that perhaps not got that much experience in that industry, and things can very easily and very quickly get into a bit of a mess. And then what happens when everything calms down and the light of day comes, and then with the benefit of hindsight, the powers that be come together and they say, well, why didn't we do this? Or why didn't you do that? Or why wasn't I told for 6 hours? Or why was this allowed to continue when this other problem was causing something further down the line? And then when you break it down, you discover actually, if they'd done a very basic business impact analysis and armed their people on the coalface, so to speak, with some basic information to be able to deal with the basic situation and how to escalate it and how to know what areas of business are the most important ones to focus on, they would have been in a much, much stronger position. So I think to answer the question, there is a lack of core understanding of the dependencies of the different business areas, and people aren't capturing them, and yet they expect everybody to know, and they've only joined the organisation 2 weeks ago.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that. And another, if I may.
Yeah, please do.
Just thinking about currently, obviously with the amount of risks we have currently, it's how organisations prioritise or separate areas such as, I'm thinking off the top of my head, post-pandemic. We've obviously got the return to work, supply chain issues. We've got talent attention and retention and attraction. Sorry, we've got the cost of living crisis, and we've got not just energy costs but energy security, and then legislation with things like the Fire Safety or Building Safety Act. How do we start to prioritise those in terms of our business, because they won't all be the same, will they?
I think you're right, and I think that's a great question actually. I think one of the difficulties is that there's so many things that can be a priority, and all of those that you've just summarised there, any of those could be a priority. So I think what's probably a really useful approach to this is to use a very basic risk analysis approach. So I think because the differences are there's the same type of risk and will have different effects in different sectors and also in different localities and different countries. And also there will be localisms and seasonal trends amongst all of that. So I think a useful exercise is actually to really boil it and distill down a basic risk assessment. So thinking about, you know, the likelihood and impact of some of these core areas, and then just try to focus in, because you won't have the resource or the money to address it all. You just won't. So I think if you've used a basic sensible risk assessment process to try and identify your higher risks and your more vulnerable areas, and then work to address the core components of them. Otherwise, a scattergun approach will leave you, you know, in total, you know, brain fry mode, I think. And equally, you just, as I say, you won't have the capacity or finance to deal with everything. So, you know, a documented, legitimate, you know, approach, and it goes back to a bit like the Plan E: proportionate, legitimate, accountable, necessary, and ethical. So I think that fundamental approach to give you the evidence from core data to legitimise what you're going to focus on and where you're going to spend the money is a very useful thing to do.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I don't know if you've got any more questions, Julie?
Yes, I have two, which hopefully we'll have time for before the hour's up. The first one is from Alan. What are your thoughts with regards to managing concurrent incidents? For example, a new variant of COVID-19 and a cyber attack, meaning that working from home and using MS Teams is no longer an option.
Again, that's another great question, I think, from Alan there. I think one of the difficulties is there's a real shift, isn't there, in what the workforce expects and what it wants, and organisations are also juggling and competing with each other to retain staff and also to recruit new staff with a certain skill sets. So I think managing sort of concurrent incidents is a really good example of it, and I think there's a danger around not having that capacity, whether you need it on site, if you're delivering critical on-site work, there's a real need to retain sufficient capacity to manage and deal with a business disruption or interruption on site. And if that's the case, then I think, you know, whether you need to say to people, well, we can't have people from a certain skill set or sector all on leave at the same time, that's a useful thing. I think the core contacts info is a good thing. So I think it's about understanding what you need to have on site to be able to maintain and recover initially, and then what can be done remotely or with agile working. So it's about understanding the differences because as I said a little while ago, things never happen at convenient times. So you try and hold on to enough troops to deal with the attack rather than deploying all of your resource elsewhere chasing new business or that. I'm not sure if that covers your point, Alan, but hopefully yes, that gives you a bit of food for thought.
Thank you for that. So we've got one more question, then more of a comment, and then I think we'll have to leave it there. So this one is from Steve. Excellent presentation, thank you. Can I ask what your views are on including playbooks in your incident response plan? For example, fire, active shooter, or pandemic?
I think that's another great question, actually, Steve. And I think the playbook thing is certainly worth exploring, because it's sort of almost, I think, and I could be wrong, but a newer or more recent term, the playbook. And I think there's huge value in that. I think what you've got to be a little bit careful of is, for example, if you think about fire incident management, there's an awful lot of legislation, etc., around fire incident management. So you don't tread on the toes of that, or have your customer or your organization think that the work you're doing supersedes those type of long-standing pieces of legislation and requirements. But I think the playbook thing is a really good thing to explore, and I think there's huge value in that. I think anything you can do that raises the profile of the requirement to have something tangible in the form of planning is really useful. Because if you were in the unfortunate circumstances of facing legislation or court purposes, if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. So I think there's huge value in the playbook exploration area.
Thank you for that. It was a really comprehensive answer. So this one's more of a statement from Brett. Having just completed the construction of my organisation's BCP and associated processes, I cannot emphasise enough the importance of testing the plan with those who are operationally impacted by a critical incident.
I think that's from Brett. I think that's a really great sort of statement, and also sort of reinforces my view is that plans should be tested and exercised. Again, just think about the definition, because a test, if you look at the definition of a test, it's normally a pass or fail thing. So some areas are better for testing and other areas are better for exercising. But I would totally agree with Brett's view. It's really valuable evidence. That's what you need, not only to validate plans, but it's great evidence that your organisation is doing this and taking it seriously. So I think it's a great observation.
Thank you for that. Just one hopefully won't be too long. Power outages are a challenge, especially for maintaining comms now that everything is digital and mobile. We would lose email and mobiles. Any top tips?
I would say, if you haven't had a look, if you was to, again, Google London Resilience Group, LRG, London Resilience Group, you'll see the work that's done with Pan-London planning. And there are a range of Pan-London emergency plans, and one is around comms and one is around power management. There's others around fuel, etc. It's worth a look at those because they're a good framework to start. So I think that's useful to do, but you're exactly right. We're so dependent. It's probably hugely disproportionate, but it's a really good point.
Thank you, Ray. That's it with the questions, Greg. So over to you for closing comments.
Brilliant, thank you, Julie. And Ray, thank you very much indeed. That was a complex subject that I think you made very plain, if you'll excuse the pun, and that's I've written down and got an email. So thank you very much indeed for your time, and thank you for all those that attended, and particularly the questions, which again I think were very broad in terms of summing up what we're looking at as far as emergency planning business continuity goes. So it remains to say thank you once more, Ray, and I hope everybody has a good remainder of their evening. Thank you very much indeed, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.